Hey everyone, welcome back to this new lesson. So in the last few lessons, we were talking about the idea of using either snare or bass drum as your form of independence against the jazz time pattern. Now what we're going to talk about is mixing the two together. Now let me give you some food for thought as far as some things to listen for regarding why we trade off between snare drum and bass drum. First reason is that we want to connect with the other instrumentation from either a rhythmic standpoint or even a pitch standpoint. So perhaps there are some higher notes from your horn player or your other comping player like piano player or guitar player. And with the higher pitch, you're gonna go for a higher pitch instrument on your drum set. So if you comp with them, you're gonna wanna comp on the snare drum because they're higher pitched. Maybe they're doing something from a melody standpoint where they're raising in the melody and you wanna do some of the notes with them on the snare. Just as well, if you're playing with some horn players or maybe a fuller brass section, or maybe your pianist goes to the low part of the instrument and they start hitting lower pitched notes, well then maybe you want to do something from the bass drum standpoint because the lower pitch of the bass drum is going to match with the lower pitch of what they're playing on their instrument. So think about that from a pitch standpoint. The other thing is we're going to get a little bit more into long notes and short notes in some later lessons. And we often assign our surfaces to long notes and short notes based on if your instrumental player is playing a held out note or are they playing more staccato. So notes that are held out are often played on cymbals, and we usually duplicate those notes with the bass drum. Or more staccato-oriented notes, shorter notes, are usually played on the snare drum. So that's another thing to think about is the musicality of what's going on in the melody, and when you're duplicating that musicality, where you want to put it on the drum set. Now, for the sake of independence, well, there's a lot of independence exercises that use bass drum and snare drum with the jazz time. And I'm going to take a sort of a similar path as I've been doing for the last couple lessons of doing some upbeat or ands between snare drum and bass drum. Now, if you haven't done any trade-off yet between snare drum and bass drum, a good place to start is maybe one measure each of the upbeat or the and of each beat, first starting on the snare and then moving to the bass drum, trading off measures like that. And that would sound like this. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. Simple enough for you. Most likely you're not going to play in a repetitive type of situation like that in a jazz tune, as jazz comping or melodies tend to change a lot and they tend to flow and you have to flow with them. But this is a good exercise to start with. Another one would then be to shrink down the amount of notes you're playing on each instrument. So instead of playing them 4 each, maybe go to 2 each. The and of 1 and the and of 2 here, and the and of 3 and the and of 4 here, like this. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. And finally, doing 1 each, just alternating. And of 1 here, and of 2 here, and of 3 here, and of 4 there. 1, 2, 3, 4. Of course, you could do the reverse of that, where you could start with the bass drum. 1, 2, 3, 4. And just doing those mix of exercises will get your independence going a little bit more between bass and snare. Be careful about really stepping into the bass drum, as we spoke about in some early lessons. We want to keep that feathering sort of concept with the bass drum where you're not really hammering it. Even the snare is a little bit lighter than your time. Especially as you go through the eras of jazz, your ride cymbal becomes a little bit more dominant. You sort of step into your ride more as you start getting more independent. And you want to keep the volume of the snare drum and bass drum at a, not necessarily a low level, but the ride needs to dominate that, okay? And as you go a little bit before that, maybe some more traditional styles of jazz, your ride and your hi-hat are the ones that really dominate, and you really step down on that 2 and 4. This is gonna get into a little bit deeper ground, but at some point, your ride starts moving around more, your hi-hat starts moving around more. But a good place to start is just keeping those steady and then moving some upbeats against it. As I've mentioned in other lessons, there are pages from certain books that I might suggest, or certain books in general, starting with page 38 of Syncopation by Ted Reed, and then moving to Modern Reading Text by Louis Belson. If you have the Ted Reed book, this would be a good time to turn to page 38 and look at line 1. What you can start working on is assigning eighth notes and quarter notes of those melodies that you're reading, that top line melody, to your bass drum and your snare drum. So anytime you have a quarter note, we play that on the bass drum because that's a little bit of a longer note. And anytime you see an eighth note, you're gonna play that on the snare drum because that's a little bit more staccato or a shorter note. So if you're looking at that line between the bass drum and snare drum with those assignments would sound like this. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. And there are many different combination exercises like that you can apply to these books where you're assigning certain eighth notes or quarter notes to the bass drum and snare drum. You can even do an exercise where you just alternate notes. This note goes on snare, the next one goes on the bass drum, the next one goes back to snare, so on and so forth. It's good to work that because it's good muscle memory for your independence. In general, you can also just improvise and go between bass and snare, trying to keep this as steady as possible and moving between the bass drum and snare drum. Something like this. 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. And those are just combinations using a lot of the melodies that I spoke of from these books and also just some improvisation in general. Again, on sort of by ear assigning bass drum or snare drum to certain notes. And as we start getting more into the songs or the tunes themselves from the music, we can be a little bit more strategic about where these notes belong based on some of the things I mentioned before: rhythm, pitch, so on. In the lessons coming up, we are going to do just that. We are going to talk about some very specific songs we've used in our curriculum program, and we're going to assign some of these things to the melodies in those songs. Stay tuned.